It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Okay, people, listen up. Before we get today's show really started with the content and everything, I want to share some joyful behind-the-scenes news. Our longtime producer and sometimes guest host, Amina Serna, welcomed her first baby last week. In fact, she was born just about a week after the last time Amina held down the fort hosting this show. We literally didn't know if we would have radio's first live on-air birth back on July 16th, but the baby did her mom her first favor and waited till her actual due date. Thank you, baby Zora. That's the baby's name, Zora. And she and her mom are both doing great. We're so happy for Amina and her husband, Paul, and just wanted to give baby Zora a hearty and public welcome to the world. Now, on Tuesdays, as many of you know, we've been reserving spot for health or climate topics on the show for a few years. That's to make sure that with all the other fast-moving headlines that grab everyone's attention from day to day, that we don't let health and climate issues fall through the cracks, especially with climate. As I've said before, the climate doesn't change at the speed of the news cycle, right? So a commitment to revisit it on a regular basis is, we think, a public service. Today we will do both, one climate segment and one non-climate public health story, because things are happening in the news that deserve a look at the underlying science. Later in the hour, we'll go beyond Dr. Anthony Fauci taking the fifth repeatedly before Rand Paul's Senate committee last week to look at some of the science underlying their rivalry, with implications both for understanding COVID in historical and ideological terms, but for the future of public health policy. In fact, we'll also talk to our guest from Stat News about a nominee of President Trump, also not making the news so much, but the nominee who specifically would be in charge of future pandemic preparedness. We'll do all that coming up. We'll begin with the latest outbreak of extreme wildfires. It was Canada a few weeks ago when those fires caused dangerous smoke conditions here in New York and even further south, as you know. Now we turn mostly to the record wildfires in Europe. The way we'll try to go beyond the headlines is this. Wildfires are not new in human history, but the intensity and frequency of them suggest something more systemic is going on, even as one country's government, the one you're probably in right now, that country, is back to going full throttle on promoting fossil fuels and limiting renewables. Here are some of the recent headlines from Europe if you haven't been following. This past July was the driest July in almost 200 years of recorded history for the UK and Wales. In France, a wildfire burned about 420 square kilometers, making it the country's largest wildfire on record. That was in Le Porge, near Bordeaux in the south. 420 square kilometers is roughly 162 square miles. The city of Paris, just by comparison, is just about 40 square miles, to let you get a sense of how big that fire was, 4 times the size of Paris. France saw what was described as the largest civilian evacuation outside wartime, as more than 224,000 people fled the region. The total number of people displaced from all of southwestern Europe is a lot higher because wildfires have forced evacuations near Madrid, too. Crews are also trying to fight fires near Athens, Greece. And those are just a few examples. It's scary, obviously, and climate change is undeniably a factor here. So to help us make sense of what's happening in Europe and also compare it to the United States and elsewhere a bit, we'll talk to Chico Harlan, global climate correspondent for the New York Times, usually based in Rome. Chico, thanks for some time today. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Where have you been reporting from these last couple of weeks, and what does it feel like on the ground?
Where was I? I guess putting the global in my job, for better and worse. I was in France, and then Malaysia, and then Pakistan, and then back to Europe. I was not on the ground for the wildfires, but I was on the ground for the heat waves that were the first domino that led to them. So basically, in the last week, where had I been? I'd been in Rome in my home, but collaborating with the Times colleagues in France and Spain and trying to like wrap our arms around the on the ground stuff, and then more from my perspective, like the science and the climate change aspect of that story.
So, talk about the heat wave first. That cracked the news headlines in the United States to some degree, but how hot was it and how unprecedented was it?
Right. I mean, it's basically the beginning of the story of the wildfires was these heat waves. First, there was one in May, late May. I mean, school was still going on, and it was described as unprecedented for that period of the year in France. In some places, it even touched like 100 degrees, which never happens in May. Then about a month later, late June, it was kind of the big one. This was the hottest heat wave that France has had ever, not just in June, but ever. It had back to back to back days where each of those days was the hottest on record. Um, and it was also exceedingly hot in Spain. That alone wouldn't have been such a terrible thing in terms of creating wildfire conditions, except that that heat, like it receded a bit, but never really returned to normal. It was hot for weeks upon weeks upon weeks, and there was almost no rain. So at that point, heading into late July, you had conditions that were primed for huge fires if just a single spark happened. And they did. So that's what happened last week. These huge fires unfolding simultaneously in France and Spain. And yes, they have been brought under control now, but it took extraordinary resources, and the fire season normally is just starting now in Europe. So it's not over.
And listeners, maybe some of you can help us report this story with a phone call or a text. Are you in or do you have any ties to any of the places in Europe where these wildfires have been raging? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433 9692. If you're in the United States or anywhere other than Europe, what are your contacts in those places experiencing and reporting to you? Also, your questions welcome for our guest, Chico Harlan, global climate correspondent at the New York Times. We're definitely going to get into European climate policy compared to the United States. And even there, as he reports, they're not going as full speed ahead on climate mitigation practices as they had been before, apparently. So we'll get into that as well. Anybody from Europe listening right now or with ties to Europe want to comment on the politics of that or ask a question, you can do that too, as well as the actual heat and the actual fires. 212-433 WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692. Chico, I gave some of the stats in the intro. What would you add to how much death and displacement these wildfires have caused across the continent?
Well, the displacement was huge. Hundreds, I mean, 300,000 or more people had to flee their homes during these wildfires just in a week. You know, to put that in perspective, all of last year, in all the wildfires that were tracked globally, the number of evacuations was less than 500,000. So you had these two events, not just as huge fires, but fires that were, and this is, I think, what made them stand out, near population centers and in areas that were where cities were threatened. It didn't reach Madrid or Bordeaux, but those were the two cities that were close by and where you would feel the air quality suffer for periods. Those events were surprisingly not deadly, not so deadly, which is incredible and is a testament to the fact that there was a lot of firefighting resources thrown at these issues. A few weeks earlier, there had been a wildfire that was in Spain that about a dozen people died. The real deadly event in Europe this year has been the heat, and that heat wave that I was describing just a few minutes ago, it leveled a death toll across Western Europe that is conservatively in the tens of thousands, 10,000. There's been another study that said 20,000 excess deaths. So, we're talking about mammoth casualties, which never get the same amount of headlines that they should, because these numbers are kind of estimates and abstractions. There's not a list of names. It's not like a plane crash where there's this immediate sense. but it's looking at population scale changes in what does an average week look like, and what did that
Mm-hmm.
week look like. But if you just step back and consider that, you're talking about developed Western Europe, where a heat wave comes in and 10,000 extra people die. That's astonishing. And we can get into why that would happen, but yeah, the wildfire, suffice to say, pales in comparison to the heat in its ability to be lethal.
Well, maybe it's worth saying. How do people die from heat?
Um, well, it depends. Not every place is equally vulnerable. We can start by saying that. And for example, if you had a couple back-to-back days above 100 degrees in Phoenix, which happens all the time, you're not going to have 10,000 extra deaths. It's a city that has built itself for weather like that. And of course, air conditioning is not the only part of the answer, but it is a big part of the answer. Also, just what do people's houses look like? How equipped are they to shield from the sun and to stay cool? Europe, especially Northern Europe, was never accustomed to heat like this. And, they often don't, these buildings were built for colder climates and they are built to trap or retain heat. France and Paris specifically, you think about the beautiful pictures of Paris with these kind of grayish, bluish grayish roofs. Those roofs are made out of zinc, and that conducts heat almost like an oven. So people who
Huh.
live on those top floors are roasting. Now, and as we know, especially in France, but many Northern European countries, air conditioning, the rates at homes is extremely low. It continues to be low. So now, if you have this combination of hot days back to back to back, apartments that hold the heat, and no air conditioning, the homes can be so hot that over some days it can become deadly. Now, obviously, if you're a young person, you have some mobility, you go to a mall, you jump into a pool, you go to a friend's house who does have AC, you take emergency measures. But if you're somebody who is old, has health disabilities, you might not be able to do that. And that is the population that suffers the most, people who were already frail, who had pre-existing conditions, or were elderly. So you have people living by themselves on those top floors, dying alone, and those deaths are hard to note in the moment oftentimes, but they are a marker of heat waves like this in Northern Europe.
One thing that you didn't mention, but we've seen elsewhere, when you talk about how more northern parts of Europe often don't have air conditioning because they haven't needed them in the past, I've read that even includes in many hospitals and nursing homes, for
Yes.
example. Do you know that to be true?
Yes, it is true. And schools too, you should mention, because um, though once you get into July and August, it's not a problem. There were schools in France in late May where it was, in the 90s every day inside the classroom, 95 degrees, and kids were suffering tremendously. Like just as elderly are more vulnerable to the heat, so are children. But yes, it's true that some hospitals don't have AC and some nursing homes don't have it. This has become a political issue where some politicians, especially Marine Le Pen, who's kind of the vanguard or one of the vanguards of the far right in France, has talked about the need to create a national air conditioning plan such that all of these public facilities are equipped. And I think that the more that France and other Northern European countries experience these heat waves, the more it becomes hard to argue with the need to lay out air conditioning on a more massive scale. Because these are places that were, yeah, they would experience some heat, but maybe just a couple days where it was really unpleasant. You start to plan differently when a couple days turns into a couple weeks of unrelenting heat and you just can't feel comfortable. You start to go crazy. I've had those summers too myself in Rome, more because of outages, not because of not because of lack of AC at all, just because the AC
Mm-hmm.
wasn't working. And you go crazy after a while. The day-to-day stress and the worrying about your health, or more in my case, my kids' health. You're giving them, dunking them in ice baths. Everybody looks unhealthy. It's 100 degrees in your house. And that's just a couple days in my case. So like I can't imagine how difficult it is, even for somebody who's healthy, to just spend day after day after day in a 100-degree house. That's what happened in France this summer.
Chico Harlan, global climate correspondent for the New York Times, based in Rome, is our guest as we talk about the heat, the wildfires. We haven't even gotten to the smoke from the wildfires in places where the wildfires themselves were not burning. We're going to get to that. And the climate policy debates going on in Europe as a result and before this summer. But we're getting some good calls and texts, Chico, from people with connections to various parts of Europe that we've been referencing. So Let's hear from some folks. Michael in Manhattan just got back from France, it looks like. Michael, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. This is Michael, the fashion designer from Hawaii who would go to the movie in flip-flops.
That's great. There should be no dress code in movie theaters, in my opinion. We haven't had that debate on the show, but I'm with you, Michael. Anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, I just got back from France for the second time, in a couple of months because I'm doing business there. And I want to say that when I moved to France in 1988 to study fashion there, I had two apartments that were on the last floor, which we call the chambre de bonne, or the maid's quarters. And they're the ones that have the slanted roofs and, you can't stand up fully in the whole apartment. But they were fine for a student, and I walked up 6 floors without an elevator, and it was fine. I had plenty of old neighbors that walked up, and I think it kept them healthy. But now that I'm looking for a pied-à-terre, since I'm traveling so often to France to do production for my work, I'm looking for an apartment, and my friends are telling me, don't touch the top floor because of the zinc roofs. And I was there, in June, just as the big heat wave where they went to like over 105 or 110 a weekend, just as it was starting. And it was tough. I mean, I wore very light clothes. I walked around with a spritzer to cool myself off and carried a bottle of water, but it was tough. And my friends, in Paris, one of their mothers lives in Bordeaux, the Bordeaux region, and was on one of the forks where the fires occurred, and she was fine, but she had places she could go if she had to leave. And I understand it's a fork, and so there was only a single road out of there, and people were having to be evacuated by boat. Every morning I would go down to my hotel, and it was the fire on the news, day after day after day after day. And it was really scary. And I was looking at apartments and talking to the landlords about the possibility of air conditioning. And there seemed to be all these rules about not being able to put air conditioners in, and that if they're an eyesore, and maybe you could have one if you hit it, sort of, But,
and also, I've read that there are strict noise standards for air conditioners in France that we don't have here. Yes. There are so many rules against it. And some people, like a friend of mine who's a health enthusiast and all that, they just think it's unhealthy. And in summers past, when I would go to France, they just, they think it's unhealthy, and they just deal with the heat. And that was before it was even that hot. Right. Now, Michael, one other thing that you told our screener before I let you go, that people now say that the real estate market has changed as a result of the fires, the evacuations from Bordeaux, the prospect of things like that happening again. What did you tell our screener about that?
I would never touch a top floor apartment, and I've been told by my friends not to. And when I have inquired about some, because they looked really nice and they were, reasonable, I asked about this, and they said that they had done insulating treatments to make it, better. But
yeah, like you said before, because of the zinc roofs, which conduct heat so well, as our guest was saying. Michael, I really appreciate your call. Really interesting story. Stay safe out there. Keep going to the movies in flip-flops, and call us again, okay?
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Aloha. Au revoir. Bye.
That's right. In Hawaii, from Hawaii to France, the well-traveled Michael at the moment in Manhattan. What about the real estate market more broadly, if you have anything on this, Chico? Because it's a debate where any kind of disaster takes place, right? If 200,000 plus people had to evacuate this time from Bordeaux, what's to say that this pattern isn't going to be more permanent and it's not going to happen in a lot of subsequent summers? And, do we keep our home? Do we move away? You know that because of sea level rise from climate change, people are having these discussions along a lot of coastal areas in the United States and elsewhere. So do you have anything on that?
Um, you know, I think that the surest area where real estate has some jeopardy is along coastlines where waters would be rising, over the coming decades. Um, that has the ability to rewrite kind of the typical property valuations. Plus, you have insurance issues. You also see that on the west coast of the U.S., in Florida, where there's, hurricane season, where the insurance also becomes an increasingly large variable. If I was thinking about where coming off of like a heat wave or just in Italy where I live and where the summers, even over the course of 10 years, have become noticeably hotter, like to me, moving and finding a place in a higher elevation is a very good real estate idea over if you consider like where would be a good place to live in 2050. I think altitude is your friend in this case. But of course, that's not really why people move. They're not like this is the human nature element of it. The moment passes, people are where they are. Changing the status quo is difficult. And wildfires and heat waves are unpredictable where they strike because it happened in Bordeaux this year doesn't mean it'll be in Bordeaux next year. Cities that have advertised themselves as being climate friendly. I think of Asheville, North Carolina as one. Nobody would have ever thought that Asheville, North Carolina was going to be in the crosshairs of hurricane related flooding.
Right.
But it happened.
Pretty
So
far inland.
you wouldn't want to. I think that it's the probably the surest things that you can think about if you were going to use all right the climate as a metric for decisions about where to live, about where to purchase, is sea level rise and altitude. Beyond that, I mean, these are global forces that we are all at the mercy of.
During the worst burning in southwestern France, I see air pollution readings in Bordeaux spike to more than 20 times the World Health Organization's health threshold. And we have this text that says, my sister and her boyfriend live in Madrid. Last week, her boyfriend, a healthy 26-year-old guy, went to the doctor because he had a persistent cough and headache, and they told him it was from the smoke. The health outcomes of these fires are serious, writes that listener with that tie to Madrid. So that's, besides ways that people die from the heat, per se, that you were describing before, there's all this, kind of downstream, to mix the nature metaphors, effects of the smoke. We saw increased hospital visits in New York when the smoke was that bad here a few weeks ago. And so that's, yet another thing from the wildfires. I don't know if it's being measured very well.
Yes, these days with where the sky turns yellow and orange, they're eerie and they do seem to be coming more frequently, but they're still not frequent, and that is something where accumulation data and daily exposure is something that drives the more long-term health outcomes. During this summer for me, I spent a week in Lahore, Pakistan, which is by some measures one of the most polluted cities in the most polluted country on earth when you talk about air quality. And there, the skies, and this is the good time of year because it's the rainy time of year. I couldn't believe just, you never see the sun. Um, and the vehicles on the road, by some accounts, emit 25 times more pollution, per kilometer than an American vehicle. So some of it is quality, some of it is industry. Um, but those are the places where, it has a true demographic change. The average lifespan in Pakistan is shortened by 6 years because of air quality. A single wildfire isn't going to do that. Maybe if you're a firefighter, but we are lucky living where we live that this is not a daily consideration in our lives because it's horrible. You can't breathe, you can't exercise, you can't be outside, you can't have kids move around with in a lighthearted way. That is it's the loss of a human right.
And on your reference before to air conditioning being key to public health in these circumstances, we're getting a number of texts. One listener writes, is the electrical wiring in Europe capable of safely handling air conditioning? Another says there's a political argument in France that if they have more air conditioning, it will make the climate worse. And another one, it's a cycle. The more AC, the more CO2 in the atmosphere, and the hotter the planet gets. I fear we have crossed the Rubicon. I mean, this is a perennial contradiction with respect to air conditioning, right?
Yes.
Air conditioning is a legitimate public health tool in places like these. The business writer Catherine Rampell had an interesting article about this contradiction recently, that, it's good that humans invented air conditioning, and it's life-saving in, so many circumstances, but at the same time, it does contribute to the global warming load. Do they deal with that contradiction in Europe differently than in the United States?
I think that in the United States, we don't think about that contradiction quite as much. In France, it is shockingly present, and really dominates the public conversation. Because I think, for an American point of view, we almost look at a deadly heat wave in Europe and think, well, the solution is obvious. Just let's do the Houston and Dubai treatment, because it does save lives. The air conditioning has been a shockingly successful lifesaver, but it's also a contributor to the very problem that makes it more important to have. So people in France seem to be, for reasons that I can't say I totally understand, very attuned to this. There is in many of the conversations that I've had with French policymakers, politicians, or climate experts, they talk about, okay, if we just deployed AC rapidly, this would be, number one, leading to more emissions, and number two, adding to the, because they pump heat out into cities, it amplifies these so-called urban heat island effects, where cities stay hot, they have a hard time shedding the heat at night, and that is one of the reasons why these heat waves have gotten deadlier. It's because these cities stay hot at night. If everybody's using AC and pumping the hot air out of their apartments, then the problem is amplified. And then there's this I also hear from many French people, an inequality aspect to it. So imagine a situation where people are using their air conditioning, making the outdoor spaces even hotter than they already are, making the emissions increase a little bit more. And then you have people who now are put in that environment that is even hotter, right, and less sustainable, and can't afford
that inequality
AC.
Expresses in various ways. There's a story on one of the New York News Organization sites just this morning about how the temperature on different blocks within New York City can vary by as much as 15 degrees at a given moment, and a lot of that has to do with how many trees there are in the immediate neighborhood, and the presence of trees tends to run, unfortunately, along economic lines. Dylan is calling from Stockholm, Sweden. You're on WNYC. Hello from New York, Dylan.
Hello. Nice to, I'm with you every morning, but we're afternoon here in Sweden.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
Thank you guys. And I'm, I keep up with the news and everything, and I have a French friend who has his uncle in Fontainebleau. And it was pretty much the same sentiment from him as in the media here in general, that, because I told him that, maybe you should try to stop flying for a while, because he's a pilot and he sends his daughter on the flight every day. But anyway, so he said, well, yeah, it's sad, but it's sad that it actually started from somebody setting the forest on fire. And we have summer news broadcast here, which is only 30 minutes at evening. Out of those 30 minutes, it was 15 minutes here interviewing like a shrink about arsonists. So, the flashback is real against the climate. And this is the country of Greta, and it's just none of wanting to be willing. And we have election year too, and none of just wanting to be willing to go for, the unpopular vote, even in the media. So I'm just very sad and that,
When you say the
it's
country of
one.
Greta, just so everybody knows what you're talking about, you're saying the country of the climate activist Greta Thunberg, and to, an American sensibility, let's say a progressive American sensibility that, oh, if we only had the values that they had in places like Sweden, we'd have more equality, we'd have less poverty, we'd have less pollution. You're saying it's not that simple?
No, and I'm just, it's just, it's one thing that the politicians are going for the popular vote, but it's even like the media, they're so afraid of, losing viewers or whatever it is. But, so it's very, and I know you're talking about Anthony Fauci later, and I just, this weekend's news said about, Anthony Fauci, like the wording was that he refused to answer as if, and never mentioning why he didn't want to answer the questions from the Congress about him taking a Fifth Amendment. So it's just about. I'm just very sad that the news broadcast here is really going for having the MAGA approach. Totally.
Well, you're obviously paying attention, and thank you for calling. We really appreciate it. So keep listening and call us again, Dylan. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
So, Chico, she suggests that even in Sweden, it's maybe not obvious that they would blame this on climate change. They want to blame it on the individual rather than something systemic. Arsonists starting forest fires. Maybe it's worth asking, how do the forest fires, these wildfires, how do they tend to get started, even if the underlying hot and dry conditions are there to make them worse?
Well, yeah, it could be a lightning strike or arson. In this case, I think arson is, at least in Europe, the starting point for the majority of wildfires. Or it could be something accidental, like you're smoking and you drop a cigarette. The arson and like the elements of human behavior seem to me like more of a static variable over time. I don't see any like societal reason why people would be more prone to start wildfires now than they were 40 years ago. You're always going to have some fools. But what has changed is the conditions on the ground that like influence the size and intensity of those wildfires once they start. Obviously, any wildfire can be destructive, even a small one. But when you have like, huge swaths of the country that are just tinder dry, then arson, like the ramifications of arson are much bigger. That is the fact of climate change. So, people can deny it all they want. I haven't looked at any particular polling on, the sentiment towards these wildfires. But my sense is that the view in Europe is, only a minority would deny the relevance of climate change to these discussions, particularly about summer conditions, because it is, like, as is often stated, Europe is the hottest warming continent on the planet. We can get into the reasons why.
Fastest warming, the pace of warming is faster than elsewhere.
The pace of warming, yes. And we can get into the reasons of why, but for now, let's just skip over those reasons and say that it's warming almost twice as fast as many other parts of the world. And I can say that from living there almost 10 years, like I notice it in not even a generation, the changes season to season. It's not exactly linear, but the number of hot days is much higher than when I first arrived. The charts definitely bear out that if you were a child of the 80s or 90s and are now living as an adult in the 2020s, it is a completely different summer experience. Completely different. I don't think people with sharp memories would tend to deny that. So the lived, oftentimes the reasons that climate change can be difficult to or easy to question is because the planetary scale moves very slowly. Specifically with heat in Europe, the change is enough to notice over the course of a generation. So I think that is one, like I wouldn't call it a good argument for climate change because it would be better if these arguments didn't have to happen. But I think this is a case where the scientific evidence is emerging quickly enough that people notice it in like the time scale of their own lives.
One more call from Europe, and it's one more call on air conditioning. Terry calling from Germany. Hello from New York, Terry. Thank you so much for your call.
No problem. So
Hi,
should I
Terry.
just tell you about air conditioning here?
Jump right in.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I'm American, but I've lived here for decades. And it's a lot harder to put air conditioning in here. You can't get central air conditioning because the walls are solid, so you can't put it in ducts. Our heating is usually done by radiator. And then the windows are completely different than American windows, so you can't get a window air conditioner to fit in. So your main option for a house that's old construction are those mini splits that you hang on the walls. And those are not very attractive. I mean, from the outside, there's a thing hanging on your house, which people don't like. And then the other cultural problem is, like the woman who called from France said, people think air conditioning is going to make you sick. Germans are terrified of drafts, and of course, with air conditioning, you get a draft.
In the winter,
So
if you
there's
leave it
just
in
a
the
lot
window.
of reasons. And it didn't, excuse me?
You mean in the winter, if you leave it in the window?
No, you don't leave them in, you can't put them in the windows here. It doesn't work. You have to put it on the wall. It's called a
Right.
mini split. And you just turn on an air conditioner and you automatically get a draft
I
from
see.
the wind that comes from the air conditioner.
From the air conditioner itself. I understand now.
And
Correct.
she's
And
right about
they
the
are
fact
terrified of
that
that.
Go ahead,
she's
Chico.
right about the fact that that there's a widespread belief that air conditioning makes you sick. I mean, I've almost internalized that myself to a degree, but like in Italy, if you have a cold, any elderly person will blame it on what they call the colpo d'aria, which is like a hit of air that generally comes from the air conditioning. Um, and they believe that like the vacillation, like when you go to an airport or a supermarket, it might be 67 degrees inside, and they think that the moving from that into a 100-degree parking lot back into a cold home is gonna make you sick, guaranteed.
Is there any science underlying that?
I haven't looked. I've always assumed that it can't be true. But, Europeans don't need to use air conditioning the way we do. Like the people that I know who are, friends of my parents, like elderly, like AC holdouts, they now get it, but they maybe use it for a half hour in the afternoon just to take the edge off. And then their apartment goes from being, dangerously hot to just hot. To me, that's a great way to use an air conditioning
Yeah,
because
for other reasons.
you're not going to make yourself sick that way. You're going to avoid getting yourself sick.
We'll continue in a minute. We'll finish up for just a few more minutes with Chico Harlan, New York Times global climate correspondent, as we've been talking about the heat, the wildfires, air conditioning controversies in Europe. And we're going to finish up on actual European climate mitigation policy compared to the United States. Even there, it's a moving target, he reports. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We're going to finish up for just a few more minutes before we go to our next segment on what Anthony Fauci and Rand Paul actually disagree about it when you strip away all the politics. What do they actually disagree about regarding COVID origins and COVID response? That's coming up. Few more minutes with Chico Harlan, global climate correspondent at the New York Times, as we talk about this summer in Europe. So you reported recently Europe looks to be shying away. Even Europe looks to be shying away from some of its most ambitious climate goals. You have a story from July with the headline, Europe proposes weaker policy for reducing emissions. What's happening?
Yeah, it's a proposal, so it has to be still debated by the member states of the European Union. This would be a change to something called the ETS, which is essentially like a cap and trade system where the cap shrinks every year for like the allowable number of emissions that in certain industries. The EU's idea is to lower the pace at which that cap shrinks. So essentially, that would allow for slightly more emissions every year for a longer period of time. That's just one of the changes that has happened from Europe on kind of this theme over the last couple of years. Like last year, Europe watered down a pledge to stop allowing new sales of petrol four-wheel cars from 2035. Um, that was, made under heavy pressure from industry, where they see that like their own European car dealers are not faring well during the EV transition, especially compared to China, which has a huge advantage in EVs. All these changes, I think they kind of come from the same theme, which is like, the easy gains of making changes are kind of over now, and this point of like if you're going to really hit your goals for a cleaner economy and societies and industries, you need to make big changes. And if you're not politically ready for that, then you start doing the stuff that Europe is doing. The full context, though, is that, since like the 90s, Europe has done a pretty good job of cutting emissions. Like the amount of greenhouse gases that the EU puts into the atmosphere is about 40% less than it was in 1990. And still on paper, their goal is for that 40% to become 90%, a 90% reduction by 2040. So, there's still like some of the same climate backlash DNA that you see in other parts of the world, well, especially the United States. But I think that it's only to a small degree compared to you don't have like the top political figures like in Europe vehemently saying that this is bunk or what they're trying to do is like this tricky middle ground appeasement of different political factions and industry, and they always end up tweaking things on the margin and making things weaker. It's not pretty, but that is what's happening. But it's not an abject rejection either of climate change or of the goals that like we need to bring these greenhouse gas emissions down. So I think that's the best way to encapsulate it. It doesn't fit pretty, like it doesn't fit in a pretty way under denialism or under like embracing of the climate goals. It's somewhere in the middle.
And I think we have one example on the phones of kind of Europe hitting a certain degree of climate policy wall. Selma in Brooklyn, originally from Prague. Selma, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Thank you for having me. So I go to the Czech Republic regularly, and while the policies are being drafted and sometimes signed into law, there's a lot of pushback from local communities because we are, as in Russia they call it dacha country, where people go to the countryside on weekends and they have homes there. And a lot of the sort of liberals, the same ones who push for these climate change policies, say not in my backyard because it's unsafe. The windmills, no, they don't look good. The solar, it's less bucolic. So that's one thing. But on a upside, what I want to say, Europe is so much more about prevention, like in health as well. And some of it is just by chance or by design. I guess before World War, so the pre-war buildings in the Czech Republic are built very solidly. And if you're in one of those homes, toward the end of summer, if there's a heat wave, yes, there's some more heat. But generally, if you build houses out of raw stone or solid brick, there's no need as much for, first of all, the heating sticks a little bit better and the coolness stays longer. And I notice here that even the new buildings, they are built like, paper basically, just wooden sticks. And then, of course, you need air conditioning, and more heat. So you're producing more and more. And finally, also the policies of bringing in better train service, cheaper train service, which is a huge thing for America. I understand the size of it is a challenge. But even easy routes, like between, let's say, New York and Montreal, it's a 14-hour ride where it could be 5 hours. And it would save so much money, and the pollution would be much less. So that's what I have to say.
Selma, thank you for all that. And you know what? We're going to let Selma have the last word, as we will leave it there for now with Chico Harlan, global climate correspondent for the New York Times, usually based in Rome. Thank you so much for this, Chico. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.